Spain had supported America in their War of American Independence and had fought the British fleet over Gibraltar, while the rest of Europe banded together at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to leave the crown alone against the world, and Russia and her neighbors, including Holland, Denmark, and Sweden, had been sick and tired of the English boarding their ships in search of contraband. The War of American Independence ended with the First Treaty of Paris signed in 1783, and the Second Treaty of Paris in 1815 ended Napoleon's great adventure in democracy, and it had been a Prussian maneuver that had won the battle when the British met Napoleon at Waterloo. By the time Napoleon was finally defeated, the English national debt had reached £860 million sterling, and the Second Treaty of Paris said that France owed England £28 million to pay for the war, but then France joined the Holy Alliance with Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Spain, and Britain refused to sign the Second Treaty of Paris because they doubted the French could be forced to pay reparation with friends like that. The double dealing and duplicity with which the British had used Napoleon to weaken the Europeans had left Britain alone in 1815 without a single remaining friend, and after the First Treaty of Paris, the British had refused to help keep the Moslem pirates from North Africa at bay. The Moslems attacked American ships and held their crews for ransom until the Americans came up with $1 million to buy back the enslaved sailors in 1795. And that much money was 17% of the yearly budget of the United States, but did little to nothing to deter the Moslem pirates. Thomas Jefferson obtained a copy of the Koran in hopes of getting an edge on the problem, and after reading it, Jefferson established the United States Navy on the 30th of April in 1798 that was called the Department of the Navy, or DON, in order to speak to the Moslems in the only language they knew, a dialogue that began on the shores of Tripoli in the First Barbary War. As soon as Jefferson became president in 1801, the U.S. Navy sent gunboats to the Mediterranean to join with the Swedes who'd been fighting the Moslems, and the Sicilians offered 3 ports for the Americans to use, and after the DON prevailed, a treaty was signed giving $60,000 to the Muslim leaders as a bribe to keep their fellow travelers under control. The man who made that deal stayed in Tripoli for 7 years until the War of 1812 broke out, and then he came back to America and committed suicide 4 years later, but it could have been murder. And after taking care of the War of 1812, in which the British enticed some Indians to attack Americans, the Second Barbary War ended with the victorious U.S. Navy ending the threat of Moslem pirates in the Mediterranean for good. The DON freed over 1,700 English slaves who were being held captive in North Africa, and when Rommel hit the North African beaches in 1941, the British were in Egypt trying to counter the Italians, who really just wanted to be friends with Britain. The Italians had been attacked in December of 1940 and were losing ground to the British until Rommel came to North Africa in February, 90 days later. And the British were right in the middle of their Operation Compass that was supposed to put an end to the Italians in North Africa and also chase them away from the Suez Canal. And Rommel interfered with Churchill's plans for Compass that would end with an Axis victory in June of 1941. Hitler had ordered Rommel to stay in place and hold the line, but instead Rommel had attacked the British on the 24th of March, and the British were surprised when Rommel attacked because they knew from their ultra-intercepts that Rommel was under direct orders to stay put, and that Hitler had sent him merely as a show of moral support to the Italians and a show of force for an upcoming arranged peace. From the 10th of April in 1941 and for the following 7 months, Rommel held Tobruk under siege, and Rommel took Benghazi, which made the Italians furious because they knew that Rommel was operating against orders, and when a telegram arrived from Berlin supporting the Italians, Their commander couldn't speak German, and Rommel rode right over his objections by pretending the telegram from Hitler upheld Rommel's actions. Hitler sent Friedrich Paulus to brief Rommel 2 weeks later on the 25th of April, and Paulus ordered him to halt the attack on Tobruk that Rommel was planning for the 30th of April, but Rommel did it anyway, and Paulus ordered him on the 4th of May to stop attacking the British altogether. Rommel was told that he would not be receiving fuel or ammo or food or water because Hitler was preparing to invade Russia, and on the 10th of May in 1941, exactly 1 year after Hitler had marched into France, Rudolf Hess flew his private Messerschmitt over to England to see the Scottish Duke of Hamilton and to negotiate a peace, hoping to save Germany from having to go through with Barbarossa. Hess had been expected, and the coastal radar batteries had been turned off to let him in. And Hess was the number 3 Nazi after Hitler and Goering, and his title was the Deputy Führer, and Hess insisted on being taken to see the Duke of Hamilton for a meeting he claimed had been arranged earlier in Lisbon. Some historians said that Hess landed his plane safely while the British newspapers reported that he'd run out of gas and crashed, and the British said the radar grid had been temporarily shut down for repairs when Hess parachuted unarmed into Britain after flying right through the radar screen on the coast. And that same day, on the 10th of May in 1941, the RAF wiped out the Iraqi Air Force. Hess had met the Duke of Hamilton's son Douglas in Germany during the Olympic Games in 1936, and they'd attended many of the same dinner parties, and Douglas Hamilton had been the first man to fly over Mount Everest in 1933 and had flown his own plane over to see the Olympic Games, where he'd been given an extensive tour of the Luftwaffe. When his father died in 1940, the Duke of Hamilton's son Douglas became the Duke of Hamilton, and he was in charge of the coastal radar defense in the sector where Hess flew through to meet him in 1941. Hess was put in the hospital because upon landing he'd injured his foot, and after visiting Hess in the hospital, the Duke of Hamilton went off to see Churchill at Ditchley, and then he went with Churchill to London to talk with the War Cabinet, where the Duke of Hamilton was told that Churchill needed Germany to destroy Russia before any peace with Hitler could be made, and the Duke was told to disavow any knowledge of Rudolf Hess. Immediately, Hess was sent to the Tower of London, and the Royal Navy sunk the Bismarck 2 weeks later on the 27th of May. Hess had politely asked a farmer and his wife to call the police so he could contact the Duke, and it had been the gesture of a nobleman, not of a commoner, and on the 4th of June, the week after the sinking of the Bismarck, the ex-Kaiser Wilhelm died in Holland. The Italians and the Germans in North Africa attacked the British 2 weeks later on the 15th of June, destroying 100 of their tanks while Rommel lost only a dozen. And Hitler sent Kesselring to North Africa, where he would outrank the Italian commander Gambara, who was Rommel's superior. That week, on the 22nd of June, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa into Russia, and Rommel was called back to Germany in July to get yelled at by Hitler. Rommel returned in August after FDR had ordered Churchill to sail over on the HMS Prince of Wales in the first week of August in 1941 to meet in Newfoundland for the Riviera Conference, where FDR personally asked Churchill what the British were up to in the Mediterranean and why the Duke of Hamilton's peace offer had been spurned. FDR told Churchill at Riviera in Newfoundland that America had been sending Lend-Lease supplies to Russia since the beginning of June, and FDR made a deal with Churchill that included the purchase of the new American M3 tanks. Rommel was planning an attack on the British in North Africa for the 15th of November to seize a British airfield, but Hitler ordered him to call it off, and Stalin began his Russian counteroffensive 2 weeks later on the 5th of December of 1941, when the temperature around Moscow had dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Stalin was heartened that America was willing to help, not just because FDR knew that conquering Russia was a British plot to expand their empire, but because if Stalin was defeated, it would be well nigh impossible to check Hitler, especially if Britain and Germany came to terms. And Barbarossa ground to a complete halt for 5 months, right before Christmas in 1941, allowing the Russians to finally counterattack in force. In North Africa, the British had launched Operation Flipper on the 18th of November to assassinate Rommel, and the secondary target was the 101st Italian Trieste Division, led by General Gambara. But Rommel wasn't even at his headquarters when the British commandos arrived, because Rommel was in Rome. For Flipper, the British sent 2 squads of 25 men each on board 2 submarines, and the squads were supposed to seize a radio station at Apollonia, and occupy the Italian headquarters at Serena with its communications mast, but instead the British assassins would spend 40 days wandering in the desert. Some of them did capture the Italian radio station, but the main mission to murder Rommel sort of falls apart on closer inspection, because if the British were intercepting all German radio traffic in 1941 with their Ultra program, they would have known that Rommel was in Rome and not in North Africa. Historians said that the British did not disclose this information to the Flipper commandos in order to protect the secrecy of the Ultra intercepts, but the known facts are that the 2 squads were landed on the beach from the 2 submarines on the night before the 15th of November, and after failing to kill Rommel, they ran into Italy's Trieste division on their way back to the beach, and they were purported to have surrendered to the Italians, while others in the squads had dispersed and become lost in the desert for the next 37 days. Flipper was one facet of Operation Crusader that had gone off the same day as the Flipper beaching on the 18th of November, and during Crusader, General Gambara was allowed into Tobruk as the British retreated. Crusader ended in a draw due to supply problems of food and water suffered by both sides, but things would improve for the British after delivery of the new American M3 tanks that ran dependably in the desert, while the British tanks decidedly had not. The British attack on the 18th of November lost them 530 tanks within the first 4 days, compared to Rommel losing 100 tanks, and the Italians knocked out another 350 British tanks, and when the British 30 Corps XXX Corps, with its 3,500 men and 700 vehicles, was heading back to Egypt on the 2nd of December in 1941, Rommel turned around to chase him, but it would be the last of his run of easy victories because Hitler was refusing to send him any more food or fuel. Rommel had attacked the British near the Egyptian border on the 24th of November and just missed a major British supply dump by only 4 miles, and it was at that point that Rommel completely ran out of supplies and was commanded to return to Tobruk to wait for further orders, putting him right back where he'd started in March. Crusader ended on the 30th of December in 1941 and was supposed to have been a British victory, leaving them the masters of the Mediterranean, and in winning Crusader, Churchill could have cut a deal with Hitler and ended the war by Christmas. The attack on Pearl Harbor would have kept America from having any say in the peace negotiations, but the Russians had turned the tide against the Germans at the Battle of Moscow, and a separate peace eluded Churchill's grasp that holiday season because not only had the Russians begun their long, steady counteroffensive towards Berlin, the Americans had shrugged off the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese had succeeded only in awakening a sleeping giant. The war would go on for another year before Churchill could again reach for a negotiated peace, but it would have to be after the Russians were defeated, and that required convincing the Americans to turn against Russia. The Germans had just lost 1 million men on the vast Russian prairies, and the Italians were proving to be better fighters than anyone had thought possible. So 1942 would be a series of skirmishes and stalemates while war plans were being revised. The Axis powers retained air and naval superiority in the Mediterranean until after the Americans landed in North Africa in November of 1942 for Operation Torch, named after the passing of the baton in the Olympic Games, because the Americans fully understood that their only choice now was to achieve victory over both belligerents, the Germans as well as the British. Thus, the torch was passed to America, and had Rommel not obeyed his own battle instincts, rather than Hitler's specific orders, the war might have ended with Crusader in December of 1941. But because of Rommel's insubordination, Hitler's war would go on for another 3.5 years, and the day after the British had launched Crusader, Hitler had appointed himself the direct and upfront supreme commander of all the German armies on the 19th of December in 1941, and that granted him the sole ability to personally negotiate with Churchill without any interference from any of his disobedient German generals. America had been sending trucks and food and motorcycles and guns and tools and telephone lines to the Russians, and the war had now taken on a life of its own, and while the British were busy trying to keep Russia from being supplied by America, 50 new tanks with supplies got through to Rommel past the British blockade in January of 1942, and he attacked the following day, on the 21st of January, destroying 100 British tanks, and Rommel took back Benghazi on the 29th of January. The British would continue to lose to Rommel in the first 6 months of 1942, and Rommel was being helped by an American official in Egypt named Bonner Fellers, who was sending details about British intentions and capabilities directly to Rommel because Pearl Harbor had just been attacked, and FDR gave direct orders to Bonner Fellers to help Rommel, and this flow of information would go on for the next 6 months. Should the British find out where Rommel was getting his information, the Americans were told to say that the Germans had intercepted the undercoded messages from Egypt. Rommel attacked the British on the 26th of May in 1942, using airplane engines mounted on trucks to kick up dust and make it appear he had a much larger force, and the day after that battle, Heydrich was assassinated in Czechoslovakia, and 3 days later the British bombed Cologne on the 30th of May in their first use of the quote-unquote streamer tactic that they called 1,000 bomber raid, and 2/3 of the bombs were incendiaries. Rommel forced the British back towards Egypt 2 weeks later on the 14th of June, and he seized Tobruk on the 20th of June, and the British 8th Army surrendered 35,000 POWs along with all the British supplies. FDR called Churchill the following day and told him to show up in December for the Arcadia Conference, and that meant Churchill had to travel over to America again that Christmas season at the end of 1942 to explain to FDR what the British were doing. The day after the British 8th Army had surrendered to Rommel in Tobruk on the 22nd of June, highlighting the launch of Barbarossa, Hitler had no choice but to promote Rommel to General Field Marshal, not simply to please Rommel's fans back home, but because he now needed Rommel to stop the Americans who were on the way to North Africa for Operation Torch to put the British out of business. 1 week after FDR ordered the British to show up for Arcadia, the British complained on the 29th of June that their loss of Tobruk was the fault of the Americans, claiming that the Germans had been able to read all the British radio codes, and that the Americans in Egypt were to blame. Rommel's attack on the 28th of June had been in direct defiance of Hitler's orders. and the British lost another 6,000 soldiers and 40 tanks, while Rommel gained more fuel and supplies, along with hundreds of British tanks and trucks. And then what was left of the British army withdrew to Alamein. Hitler had completely cut Rommel off, while the British were somehow in possession of detailed information about every German's shipment being sent to Rommel, as well as all his troop movements, and the British claimed they had been decoding German messages rather than having been informed directly from Berlin by telephone. The Italians were also diverting Rommel's supplies into the black market, and when Rommel attacked at El Alamein in July of 1942, the Luftwaffe stayed away, while Rommel was bombed by the RAF, and Rommel lost his Signals Intercept Company 621 at El Alamein on the 11th of July that had been supplying him with the priceless intelligence from British radio communications. Churchill stopped off in Cairo in August on his way to see Stalin, and Churchill appointed Bernard Law Montgomery to lead the British Army in North Africa, and from then on things went badly for Rommel, with Hitler purposely starving him and Rommel continuing to act on his own rather than following Hitler's orders. Unbeknownst to Rommel, he was screwing up Churchill's strategic plan to make a separate peace with Hitler before the Americans could get into the fight, but the real wrench in the works was the cold reality that the Germans had failed to beat the Russians during Operation Barbarossa.